Hey guys, Hutchy here, and welcome to the Chan. Today I want to talk to you about the history of the Canadian Heavyweight Championship. Specifically this championship here, which was used by Frank Tunney's NWA Toronto territory from 1978 until about 1984. But the reason that I wanted to talk to you about this is that Maple Leaf Wrestling is returning to the Mecca, to Toronto, to Maple Leaf Gardens for the first time in 40 years, and they will be crowning a brand new Canadian Heavyweight Champion on May 10th. A champion which I believe will be the spiritual successor to this title right here. Now, Scott Damore has recently purchased the naming rights and trademarks to Maple Leaf Wrestling. He's been gathering up as much footage and old matches as he can, and he's been placing them all on the MLP YouTube page. You should go and check that out. But he is using the call letters of MLP because MLW is currently being used by Court Bauer's Major League Wrestling. But MLW, Maple Leaf Wrestling, was the name of Tunney's promotion from 1977 right up until they were bought out by the WWF in 1984. But even before 1977, they were kind of casually using the name. Tunney was the only one who had the rights to promote out of Maple Leaf Gardens, which he'd been doing all throughout the 70s, 60s, 50s, all the way back to 1931 when the facility originally opened, and Frank Tunney and Jack Corkin got the promotional rights to run exclusively out of Maple Leaf Gardens. But Toronto itself has been an absolute powerhouse of a territory for years and years. I mean, we're talking major controversy and title changes. Whipper Billy Watson defeating Lou Thez as Whipper Billy Watson whipped Thez out onto the famous Maple Leaf Wrestling ramp and slammed the NWA champion down on the ramp before walking back in the ring and getting himself a count-out victory and becoming the new NWA World Champion. And there was a lot of controversy around that, let me tell you. But of course, here in Toronto, in Bizarro World, we cheered for the heel tactics of our Canadian hero, Whipper Billy Watson, and we were all very happy that he became the NWA champion. But also, Terry Funk losing the NWA title to Harley Race right here in Toronto with the infamous Fred Atkins as special guest referee. If you know your Toronto and Montreal wrestling history, you will know the name of Fred Atkins. But even the catalyst for what is today WWE, WWF, Buddy Rogers was the NWA champion and was basically mostly being promoted by Toots Mondt and Vince McMahon out of New York and their northeastern stronghold there. They did not want to let Rogers travel around America and defend the title. I mean, they were basically his managers. They promoted him exclusively, and the NWA was not pleased with that. A scheduled 2 out of 3 falls match here in Toronto, they sent Lou Thez, who at the time was 5-time world champion and a well-known shooter, to take on Buddy Rogers, who was not a shooter. Rogers was a showman. And when Thez showed up, he said, listen, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. And of course, Rogers acquiesced. He did it the easy way, a single fall victory for Thez, and he was announced as the new NWA champion. But Mondt and McMahon, they did not recognize that title change. They continued to promote Rogers as the NWA champion for months and months afterwards until the NWA forced their hand and they officially started the WWF. They had one of their fun little Rio de Janeiro tournaments and crowned Rogers as the first WWF champion. But even recently at Elimination Chamber with John Cena turning heel, I mean, Toronto has always been a hotspot for controversy and for wrestling and title changes and all kinds of stuff. And I am very happy that Maple Leaf Wrestling will be returning here to Toronto at Maple Leaf Gardens. Now, Scott's Maple Leaf Wrestling has run 2 events up to this point, spread out over 4 nights, the 2-night Forged in Excellence and the 2-night Mayhem that happened earlier this year in March. But those events happened in Windsor, Ontario. Now, Windsor has a very long-standing history in pro wrestling. I mean, the birthplace of Killer Kowalski, the birthplace of Abdullah the Butcher, the birthplace of the flipping Canadian Destroyer Piledriver, which I believe Petey Williams debuted at Scott's own promotion in Windsor, Border City Wrestling, which is one of many promotions that have run out of Windsor over the years. I mean, in the 1960s, there was a Canadian championship owned by Gene Kiniski and Bobo Brazil and was defended along with the U.S. title over the border in the Sheik's big-time wrestling promotion in Detroit. But that promotion was run by Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett. My boy, like this, that Jim Barnett. But also in the 1970s, Man Mountain George Cannon, a very well-known wrestler, but more well-known as a promoter. He ran his Superstars of Wrestling out of Windsor for years and had a great relationship with Johnny Rougeau, and they brought Superstars of Wrestling there in 1977 and got themselves a television show out of Montreal, which was the same year that Tunney got himself a television show based out of Toronto, officially called Maple Leaf Wrestling. And that was the year that Tunney's promotion officially used the name Maple Leaf Wrestling all the way up until 1984, when they were bought out by the WWF. But with the arrival of television in 1977, also arrived the need for a new Maple Leaf Wrestling Canadian Heavyweight Champion. The first one, in fact, that they would be crowning. Now, I know what you're thinking. If Tunney had been promoting out of Maple Leaf Gardens all throughout the 70s, 60s, 50s, all the way back to 1931, and even before at some of the local Stampede shows and outdoor events, then did they not have a champion that entire time? Well, let's get into it.
Good evening, wrestling fans from Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto once again. And this week, Frank Tunney has another fine card lined up for you.
Now, there had been titles defended in Toronto long before the main championship we're going to talk about here today, including a local world champion in 1938. But the first officially recognized Canadian champion in the area was a young man named Earl McCready. And in the late 1930s, McCready left and went to New Zealand, and while he was there, he won the British Empire title. And he left the New Zealand promotion with that championship, returning in 1941, where Frank Tunney immediately recognized his claim as a Canadian champion and recognized the British Empire championship that McCready had. But at the time, Tunney was recognizing Whipper Billy Watson as his Canadian champion. So, of course, they had themselves a unification bout. And McCready came out on top, and both McCready and Tunney recognized the British Empire title as the Toronto Championship from that point on. But there were many Canadian championships as we moved on into the 40s and 50s. There was a Canadian champion in Stampede Wrestling in Calgary, as well as NWA All-Star out of Vancouver. But Toronto would mainly stick with the British Empire title all the way until 1962, when for some reason it migrated out to NWA All-Star in Vancouver and was defended there until it was decommissioned in 1967. Now, luckily in 1962, Johnny Valentine debuted in Toronto with his U.S. title, which very quickly became known as the Toronto version. And for the next 13 years, Valentine would make Toronto his home away from home. And from 62 until 69, he dominated, defending the title against all kind of ne'er-do-wells, and even trying to take the NWA title many times, facing Lou Thez, Dory Funk Jr., Gene Kiniski, and even Jack Briscoe. But his big feud with Tiger Jeet Singh was what brought in the money. The two of them went to hour-long draws. At one time, they even had a match that had so much heat, the rematch had to happen at the massive Maple Leaf Stadium down on the Toronto Lakeshore. And of course, Tiger Jeet Singh had Fred Atkins, the infamous Fred Atkins, as his manager during this period of time. But in 1969, the Sheik arrived from Detroit with his U.S. title, and supremacy between Valentine and Sheik went on for about a year or so. The Sheik came out on top, and it was the Sheik streak, 127 wins straight without a loss, that really changed the fortunes for the Toronto area. In Detroit, the Sheik had a version of his U.S. title, but in Toronto, the Sheik had a completely different U.S. title lineage, and he never lost here. He would face Sammartino, Bockwinkel, Vern Gagne, Bob Backlund. He would beat them all. And in fact, these were short matches. He would whip his opponents into a frenzy, and they would often get disqualified or counted out trying to get their hands around the neck of the Sheik, and the fans felt the same way. The attendance at these events started to go down, and by the summer of 1977, it was the lowest attendance that Tunney had seen since the early 60s, and it was time to part ways with the Sheik. So oftentimes when people talk about the Sheik's run here in Toronto, they'll talk about how he killed the city, he killed the town. and there's a lot of validity there. But it's not like it wasn't popular at first. It was a very successful run. I mean, Tunney was packing them into the Gardens for the first part of the Sheik's run. He basically turned Johnny Valentine permanently face for the rest of his career, but anybody who came into town, he beat all the baby faces, but the heels, I mean, Tiger Jeet Singh could come back from Japan, he'd get cheered, let's beat the Sheik. I mean, Angelo Mosca, the monstrous and vicious heel Mosca, he would get cheered. Like Gene Kiniski, Jack Briscoe, all of them stalwart heels, they would all get cheered, because everybody wanted to see the Sheik get his comeuppance, and you know, that's the problem, he never did. But people will talk about how the real death nail for Tunney would have been this series with Andre. Now, in 1973, the Sheik had a 3-match series with Andre, and then later another 3-match series for Tunney. The problem is Andre only won one of those matches, and you know, the fans were getting kind of sick of Sheik's standard blow-off technique of a cage match and getting knocked out of the door by his opponent so the Sheik would win. And you know, just in general, that and the fact that they were touring with other companies was part of the death nail here for Tunney. Obviously, the Sheik could smell blood in the water, and he started touring with the Bear Man, the Wild Man, Dave McKigney, all over Ontario. Tunney was just running weekly at the Gardens, you know, and McKigney knew the Sheik. He'd worked for the Sheik. He knew Andre. He was in the Sheik's I Like to Hurt People movie, and at this time in the summer of '76, he was traveling all over, bringing Andre up. Supposedly, Andre had a great time that summer with the Bear Man, and they call him the Bear Man because he trained bears to wrestle in the ring, and Andre had a great time at his farm just north of Toronto here. But the Wild Man would tour all over. I mean, you can fit the UK inside of Ontario twice. Ontario is massive. And all up north, there are tons of native reserves. And the native tours are a big deal here for young wrestlers and in Canada. I mean, recently they released Tony Condello's Death Tour movie. I was very lucky to be the keynote speaker at its premiere here in Toronto. But that showcases the very brutal and unglamorous lifestyle of these death tours, these ice tours up north. And these are the same tours, these IWA wrestling tours for Tony Condello that Edge went on, Christian went on, that Rhino went on these tours, Joey Legend, Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Don Callis. And this is not, you know, like I said, very unglamorous. We're talking churches, community centers, Chinese restaurant parking lots.
We're just getting ready for the big cage match. No, not cage match, clown match. Clown match at Topo Gigio Restaurant. Greatest wrestling crowd in the history of pro wrestling.
But this poster here, the reason I wanted to show you this poster is this was in Galt. I would have told you it was way out there, you know, maybe in the reserves or out in the boonies in the farmlands here in Ontario. But turns out Galt is actually just a little village not far from Toronto here. And that makes sense, you know, keep Andre close to home. You don't want to travel too much with Andre in the car. He's obviously a big dude. This is a prime example of some of the Wild Man's great posters. I'm lucky enough to have quite a few of these, but one of the rare Sheik Andre posters. But see on this card, lots of local regulars. Don Kent here, Haystacks Calhoun, a young Haystacks Calhoun coming in. Obviously, you know, the Sheik wasn't all that forthcoming with the wins on these tours either. So at the end of the night, there could be a battle royal. And of course, Andre and Haystacks, the two big men, a great way for Andre to get over at the end of the night and get those cheers with a foil like Haystacks. But you also got the Crusaders here, Billy Red Lions and Dewey Robertson, the international tag team champions on and off during this time period for Maple Leaf Wrestling. You know, Billy Red Lions, a staple at Maple Leaf all the way back to the 50s. And of course, the talking head, the announcer for Maple Leaf Wrestling once the WWF took over in '84. And Dewey Robertson, his tag team partner here. Dewey, you know, looking pretty clean cut here. This is an old photo for this time period. We'll talk a bit about Dewey later on, but, you know, he had an afro, I think, during this time, but Dewey had some crazy hair later on. Dewey Robertson ended up becoming the missing link Went down to Texas for World Class, and certainly had a great end to his career there with that character. His autobiography, Bang Your Head, is certainly an interesting read for sure. But all of this non-exclusivity and these extra tours here, all of this is what combined to bring the downfall of Tunney. And now he himself had a missing link. His chain was broken. The Sheik was gone. And by the fall of 1977, Tunney was looking to forge some new bonds.
Over and out, brother.
He is young and capable, an exciting young wrestler.
With the Sheik decimating business and leaving in the summer, taking his U.S. title with him, the new television show wasn't exactly bringing in new fans. In fact, it was providing them with free wrestling at home. The new branding to Maple Leaf Wrestling was certainly a positive direction, but he needed a new big prize for his main event scene, something to attract fans to the actual events. Now, the AWA answered the call at first, sending Nick Bockwinkel to defend their title, but it wasn't quite enough to turn business around, and attendance stayed at its lowest since the late 1960s. Tunney needed something fresh, something young, some young blood. And young blood is exactly what he got. Youngblood, in fact. Along with Ricky Steamboat, Ric Flair, and veterans like the Anderson brothers and Wahoo McDaniels as he approached Jim Crockett Jr. and his Mid-Atlantic promotions. Jim had just taken over from his father, and the area was on fire in the late 1970s, and Tunney wanted some of that smoke to waft up to Toronto. Tunney entered into an official agreement with Jim Crockett Promotions and George Scott. The George Scott who facilitated the TBS buyout of the Georgia Championship Wrestling time slot, creating Black Saturday. The George Scott that worked with Vince McMahon to help spearhead the first WrestleMania for the WWF. He was even involved in the initial negotiations with Stu Hart to get his Stampede territory for the WWF. A member of the Flying Scots with his brother Sandy, George certainly was far more influential behind the scenes in wrestling. But at this point, George Scott, acting as 410430 Ontario Limited, had just made the moves to become 25% owner of the new entity called Frank Tunney Sports Promotions Incorporated, also known as Maple Leaf Wrestling. And they certainly didn't waste any time, as the next month, in October of 1978, the stars of Mid-Atlantic Wrestling would debut in Toronto, and Flair and Steamboat in particular would bring fans back in droves to the Gardens. The Mid-Atlantic area had two major singles champions at the time, the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Champion and the U.S. Champion. Now, this U.S. title would blend seamlessly into the long lineage in Toronto dating back to Johnny Valentine in '62. And at this time, Flair was the U.S. Champion and embroiled in a huge wild feud with Steamboat all over the Carolinas, and they would blow away fans with their exciting battles over the title. But also on this first card was Dino Bravo. The Montreal native had debuted back in Toronto in 1973, but hadn't been around in a while. In fact, he was a regular on the Crockett circuit as a babyface and had just recently had the WWF Tag Team Championships alongside his partner Dominic DeNucci. He would take on Ken Patera on that card and team up with the WWF champion Bob Backlund on the next card to face AWA Tag Team champions Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. Bravo would also start to be seen on the Maple Leaf TV show, teaming with Steamboat and on his own in singles competition. Tunney was still close with McMahon Sr. and the AWA office, which facilitated him being able to bring in stars from those promotions for his television shows, including Bob Backlund, which was one of Tunney's favorites. The third card featuring the Mid-Atlantic stars would take place on December 17th and would see Steamboat beat Flair to take the U.S. title in the main event. This showed just how much faith Crockett had in the partnership, allowing the title change to take place here in Toronto and the blow-off of the feud to continue down in the Carolinas. But in the semi-main event, Dino Bravo would take on Gene Kiniski for the newly created Canadian heavyweight title. Bravo was certainly a qualified contender. Kiniski, however, needed no qualifying, flying out from his home in Vancouver for the bout, and was years into a long association with Toronto, having been one of the biggest stars in the city since his debut here in 1956. Through his NWA title reign in the late 1960s and into the Sheik era, he remained a regular on the Toronto scene. He'd held the British Empire Championship here in Toronto and had also been a Canadian champion in both Calgary and Vancouver. And by 1978, even though he was coming to the end of his career, he was still regarded as a top challenger in the NWA and was salivating at the chance to come to Toronto and become that promotion's inaugural Canadian champion. But the sweetest plum for Kiniski was the opportunity to spit in the face of his longest and most hated rival, as the man presenting the championship to the winner of the bout was Whipper Billy Watson.
Here's a look at other fine JVC products. Meet the professional.
Here we go. Now remember, a lot of things hang on this match tonight.
The night of December 17th, 1978 had been appointed Whipper Watson Appreciation Night to recognize his 30-year association with the Easter Seals charity. The card also had, for the first time in many years, an autograph table set up featuring Bravo, Steamboat, Paul Jones, Jimmy Snuka, and others signing and handing out free photos of themselves. Watson entered the ring at the beginning of the contest, and upon the Whipper's introduction, Kiniski absolutely blew up and berated the then 62-year-old Watson. The jolly and now rather rotund Canadian legend simply laughed it off, but as Kiniski's tirade intensified, the Whipper threw up his fist and took his traditional stance as the Maple Leaf Garden crowd exploded in support of their now retired champion. Now, Kiniski may have been Canada's greatest athlete, but he certainly was no fool. He was in the twilight of his long and storied career with a championship match right ahead of him and was planning to use those long years of experience to take out his young opponent as quickly as possible. Bravo was obviously perceived to be the underdog, and as the bell rang, Kiniski attempted to take Bravo to the mat right off the hop. Bravo's youth and brute strength was too much for the veteran, though, as he powered out of a leg lock to the surprise of Kiniski. The Montreal native was intent on turning this into a brawl, and Kiniski was more than happy to oblige. The men took turns throwing each other out of the ring onto the hard concrete floor, and on one exchange, Bravo seemed to twist his back rather badly. Kiniski came down off the apron with some big stomps and kicks as the crowd seethed. He then moved over to Watson and continued his berating from the beginning of the match, and hurled some choice expletives at his former rival. Throwing Bravo back in the ring, Kiniski attempted to apply another leg hold, which Bravo once again powered out of. He also reversed an Irish whip, which led to a flying head scissors and a couple of drop kicks. Bravo kept increasing the pace faster and faster, which took its toll on Kiniski, and Bravo would eventually earn a clean pinfall in the center of the ring at 14 minutes and 58 seconds of the bout, and Whipper Watson would present the title to the new champion. The new Canadian heavyweight title represented the best in Toronto and would go on to be defended here over the next 6 years, years that ended up being the final, with Toronto as an NWA stronghold.
Hey, I got an idea. How about you give me the belt?
I love it.
So the actual Canadian Heavyweight Championship belt that was presented to Bravo was a bit of an enigma. As you can see, it proudly displays TWWA Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. And it was made by noted Toronto belt maker Alex Molko, who started wrestling for Toronto in 1961 as a member of the Kalimikoff brothers, but was far better known worldwide and all over North America as Nikita Molkovich. And he was from Ukraine, had settled in Toronto in the 60s, and in the war was a foundry engineer making airplane and submarine molds, so he certainly had the skill necessary for making title belts. He was also an avid sculptor, painter, violin collector. He was a pretty interesting guy, but dabbled his feet in the water here in Toronto by making a belt buckle for Frank Tunney, a very famous piece, but soon after was commissioned to make title belts. He made our own international tag team titles, the titles I mentioned earlier that the Crusaders held, but also made the WWF Heavyweight Championship and the WWF Tag Team titles at the time. He even worked for them as a manager, managing Pedro Cadoy and Juan Sebastian as a masked tag team called the Rugged Russians. But he also made titles all over the states, the Florida tag team titles, Texas heavyweight title, any title you saw with this kind of oval faceplate design was most likely a Molko title. People copied him after a while, but he said in the 70s himself, by his own hand, he made about 50 titles, and he charged about $500 a piece. But the TWWA Heavyweight Wrestling Championship was one of his first. And the real question is, what is the TWWA? So for years, the lettering of TWWA on the title belt was a topic of discussion. A lot of people might assume it stood for Toronto World Wrestling Association or Alliance, but that designation had never been used here in any fashion. The territory was known specifically since 1977 as Maple Leaf Wrestling and the Queensbury Athletic Club previous to that. But TWWA actually stood for the Trans World Wrestling Association. In 1969, Danny Hodge and Lou Thez attempted to run a new promotion in Japan called the TWWA, and Tunney was said to be one of the initial backers for that startup. In addition to Thez, who had both won and lost the NWA title here in Toronto, they enlisted well-known local stars like the infamous Fred Atkins, Bulldog Brower, and Waldo Von Erich. Now, I jokingly call Fred Atkins the infamous Fred Atkins, but it's just because he had served here in Toronto on the local scene for 40 years, both as a wrestler, trainer, manager, and referee. Bulldog Brower had been a top heel in Toronto since the 1960s, and the evil, dastardly heel Waldo Von Erich was actually a Canadian whose name was Wally Sieber, and he was from Holland Landing, Ontario, just north of Toronto. So one hell of a management team here for the young TWWA promotion, and both Hodge and Thez would trade the championship back and forth for the short time the promotion was active in Japan. Now, all of these Toronto names being involved in the promotion explains the connection to TWWA, but the title belt that Hodge and Thez wore and traded back and forth in Japan was a totally different belt. It appears that Molkovich was commissioned to make this title belt around the time that the promotion was christened, but this belt was never actually used. So years and years after the promotion had folded, Tunney had access to this belt and was obviously allowed to use it. So Toronto now had a new homegrown and home-forged championship belt. But actually, here's where things get really fun and really complicated. And I'm going to blow your mind, especially if you're a Japanese wrestling fan. The TWWA was the original IWGP. It was the first ever governing body for a Japanese wrestling company, and basically Inoki copied the idea, the same way he's copied many ideas throughout his career. Now, there is an entire video worth of information here, but I'm going to try and very quickly give you some of the bullet points before we get onto it in the future. But in 1957, Lou Thez lost his first NWA World Championship. He'd been champion for 5 years. He lost it to Dick Hutton in Toronto. And from there, he went on kind of a pseudo vacation. He wrestled a lot less and he wrestled internationally, but the NWA didn't want him to have no connection to them. So they made him the NWA International Championship and just gave it to him. And he was defending it for a while. Eventually, Riki Dozan got his hands on this title, and this became the main title in Japan, the NWA International Championship. Also went along with the United National Championship and things like that. But let's not get too complicated. The bottom line is the JWA was the powerhouse in Japan when wrestling first started there. But when Riki Dozan died, there was a conflict with the management within JWA, and a bunch of them split off to create the IWE, the International Wrestling Enterprise. They had a shortage of talent, and they did still work with the JWA for a while, but that was in October of 1966. And even though they worked with Hiro Matsuda, Antonio Inoki, and in America they worked with Johnny Valentine, Eddie Graham, Tarzan Tyler, Sputnik Monroe, Bob Orton, they worked with whoever they could get, but they didn't actually have their own full-time roster like the JWA. And in January 1968, they had what they called the Opening World Series, which featured Lou Thez, Danny Hodge, Hans Schmidt, Waldo Von Erich, Bulldog Brower, and the infamous Fred Atkins as a referee for a majority of the matches. These ended up becoming the TWWA shows the following year in 1969, and these shows were exhibition shows that had Thez and Hodge on top, trading this title back and forth, very much like how Inoki had his IWGP tournaments for years before legitimizing that as his main title. At that time, he was using his NWF title as the main title for New Japan, a title which he got from Johnny Powers and Pedro Martinez in Buffalo, who also worked with Tunney back and forth all the time. Buffalo was the final stop for all of Tunney's tours and all of his television tapings, and they had a massive relationship with the guys at the NWF, who then sold their title to Inoki when he bought his title from Johnny Powers, and then he created the IWGP, which was basically a way of legitimizing his promotion of New Japan Pro Wrestling in a way that other promotions didn't, but in the way that the IWE invented. They thought if they had this governing body with all of these famous and well-known American wrestlers that could kind of legitimize the matches they were putting together. So the TWWA was the original IWGP. They had about a half a dozen shows, massive shows with all kinds of international talent, and they even had a tag team tournament on these shows, crowning the first ever TWWA tag team champions, which were the Fabulous Kangaroos. But eventually, the IWE folded these titles and made their own titles. In fact, the tag team title became the IWE tag team titles, which was the first ever championship that Andre the Giant held alongside Michel Nandor. And look how great he looks in this picture. This is one of the very few championships that Andre had ever held. And of course, here's once again the connection to Montreal and Canada through these guys. And think about it. Andre was a member of International Wrestling in Montreal, one of the owners, and also worked with Grand Prix Wrestling in Montreal. And then Inoki creates the International Grand Prix, the International Wrestling Grand Prix, as his governing body. The nuance and how far you can dig is absolutely massive, and it doesn't really get the recognition that I think it deserves. Now, I can do an entire video getting really deep into the IWE connection, Inoki taking the inspiration for creating his governing body, but, you know, let's get away from that. We'll make an entire video on it in the future, but the TWWA was short-lived, but was extremely powerful, and its influence on the wrestling world and on Japanese wrestling cannot be understated and deserves an entire video of its own. But the TWWA legitimizing the IWE, which then closed in 1981, and all of their major stars went on to create the stable that had the first ever invasion storyline in wrestling history, as they invaded New Japan Pro Wrestling, which was later copied by Japanese UWF and by the NWO in America. But speaking of America, the brand new Canadian champion Dino Bravo, the very next night after beating Kiniski, he flew to America the very next day, headlining in New York City at Madison Square Garden, teaming alongside Dominic DeNucci and Dusty Rhodes. And we now know who Frank Tunney's first ever Canadian champion was for Maple Leaf Wrestling. And by the time you are watching this video, we will all know who the first ever Canadian champion is for Scott Damore's Maple Leaf Wrestling. But I will leave this video here at that right now, and when we return with part 2 of the history of the Canadian Heavyweight Championship, we will follow the many triumphs and tragedies of the reign of Dino Bravo, as well as the many eclectic people that held the championship, like Sergeant Slaughter, Mr. Fuji, Big John Studd, and of course my favorite champion, the great Hussein Arab, the Iron Sheik, who terrorized Toronto and loved the city so much that he ended up retiring here and living here for many years. I was lucky enough to get to know Sheiky a little bit. But for Dino Bravo and for Frank Tunney, very soon, the hammer was about to drop.